The streets of London were bustling as tourists gathered near the grand gates of Buckingham Palace. Among them was Maya, a vibrant young black woman in her late 20s, with a confident stride and a camera slung across her shoulder. She'd been dreaming of this trip for years, saving every penny to explore the city she'd read so much about. Her passion for photography brought her to this iconic landmark, where the famed royal guards stood still as statues, admired for their discipline and unwavering demeanor. Maya marveled at the architecture and began snapping photos, her laughter blending into the hum of the crowd. As she approached the guard closest to her, she noticed a small detail, a unique insignia on his uniform. Intrigued, she leaned in to get a better look, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Excuse me," she said with a warm smile. "Do you mind if I take a close-up of that badge? It's quite interesting." The guard, a tall, stoic figure named Edward, glanced down at her from beneath his bearskin hat. His face was a mask of sternness, but the tension in his jaw hinted at something deeper. "Keep your distance," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter around them. Maya stepped back, her expression softening with understanding. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bother you." But Edward's gaze didn't waver. His eyes narrowed as he scanned her from head to toe, and the faintest hint of a sneer crossed his lips. "Tourists like you always push boundaries," he muttered, barely audible but cutting enough for Maya to catch. Her smile faltered. "I'm sorry if I've upset you," she replied, her tone measured, trying to diffuse the tension. Yet, Edward's words echoed in her mind. "Asterisk tourists like you, asterisk," the implication stung, but she brushed it off, unwilling to let the moment ruin her day. As Maya turned to rejoin the crowd, a murmur rose among the onlookers. "Did you hear what he said to her?" One woman whispered to her friend. Others exchanged uneasy glances, some taking out their phones to record the scene. Edward, oblivious to the attention, seemed satisfied with his remark. To him, it was just another day of maintaining order. He didn't think twice about Maya or how his words might have affected her. Maya moved away, trying to shake off the encounter, but her heart was heavy. She found a quieter spot and sat on a bench, scrolling through her photos to distract herself. But the moment replayed in her mind, each detail sharpening her sense of hurt and disbelief. Why had he singled her out? Was it the color of her skin? The thought made her stomach churn. Unbeknownst to her, Edward's colleagues had noticed the interaction too. Among them was Liam, a fellow guard known for his keen sense of fairness and justice. Liam had always believed that wearing the royal uniform was a privilege that came with the responsibility to uphold dignity and respect for all, regardless of background. During their next shift break, Liam approached Edward. "I saw what happened earlier," he said, his voice low but firm. "That woman did nothing to deserve your attitude." Edward brushed him off with a scoff. "She was getting too close. These tourists think they own the place." Liam frowned. "That's not what I saw. And your comment, it wasn't professional." Edward rolled his eyes, unwilling to engage. "Mind your own business, Liam." But Liam couldn't ignore the unease settling in his gut. He decided to keep an eye on the situation, sensing that this incident might not be as inconsequential as Edward believed. Meanwhile, Maya shared her experience with her social media followers, framing it as a reflection on resilience and grace in the face of ignorance. Her posts gained traction, sparking conversations about respect and the subtle ways prejudice can manifest. As the day wore on, Maya returned to the palace gates, determined not to let one sour encounter define her trip. She found herself drawn to the same spot, her camera in hand, a resolve stronger than before. She captured the guards, the gates, and the vibrant energy of the tourists, all while reminding herself that her voice and perspective mattered. But the tension wasn't over. Something unexpected was about to unfold, something that would force Edward to confront his actions in a way he never anticipated. As the crowd thickened and the sun began to set, an unforeseen twist lay just around the corner, waiting to turn the day into a lesson Edward would never forget. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, its warm glow painted the palace gates with hues of gold and orange. Maya stood with her camera, determined to capture the beauty of the moment, even as the weight of the earlier interaction lingered in her mind. She adjusted her lens, focusing on the intricate details of the wrought iron, each curve an emblem telling a story of history and tradition. She loved moments like these, where her passion for photography allowed her to find art in unexpected places. From the corner of her eye, Maya noticed a small boy with a curious grin, tugging on his mother's sleeve. The child seemed fascinated by the royal guards, their stoic presence captivating his imagination. His mother gently guided him closer to the fence, reminding him to stay back as he waved enthusiastically at the guards. Maya smiled, finding comfort in the child's innocence. Edward, however, remained unmoved, his gaze fixed straight ahead. His rigid posture was a sharp contrast to the lively energy around him. He prided himself on being unshakable, a model of discipline. Yet, as the evening wore on, he found his thoughts wandering back to the earlier exchange with Maya. He couldn't explain why her presence had unsettled him. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, unbothered by his stern demeanor, or the way her eyes had lingered on him, not with fear, but with quiet strength. It was a look he wasn't used to. As Edward wrestled with his thoughts, Liam observed him from his post a few meters away. Liam was known among the guards for his keen intuition, and today something about Edward's behavior struck him as off. He had always respected Edward's dedication to his role, but he couldn't shake the memory of his colleagues' dismissive words to Maya. Liam believed in the honor of their duty, a duty that extended beyond standing still in a uniform. To him, it was about representing fairness and respect for everyone who came to witness the tradition of the royal guards. Maya continued to take photos, her movements deliberate and precise. She crouched to capture the golden light reflecting off the palace windows, her mind drifting back to her childhood. Growing up in a small town, she had often felt like an outsider, her dreams of exploring the world seen as far-fetched by those around her. But she had always been determined, her love for photography serving as both an escape and a means to connect with the world in ways words couldn't. That determination had brought her here, to this moment, standing in front of Buckingham Palace. As she reviewed the images on her camera, a voice startled her. "You have a good eye for detail," someone said. Maya looked up to see Liam standing a few feet away, his posture still formal, but his tone kind. He had stepped out of line briefly during a shift change, seizing the opportunity to approach her. "Thank you," Maya replied, surprised but appreciative of the compliment. "It's been a dream of mine to capture places like this." Liam nodded. "It's a beautiful spot, isn't it? We're lucky to be here, even if it's in a different capacity." His eyes softened as he spoke, and Maya felt a warmth in his demeanor that contrasted sharply with Edward's earlier hostility. She hesitated before asking, "Can I ask you something? About the guards, I mean." "Of course," Liam said, his tone encouraging. "Is it always this serious?" Maya asked, searching for the right words. "I mean, I understand the importance of tradition, but I wasn't expecting the intensity." Liam chuckled lightly. "It's part of the role. Discipline is key. But we're human too, even if it doesn't always show." Maya smiled at his honesty, but before she could respond, the atmosphere shifted. A commotion erupted near the gates as a man in a suit pushed through the crowd, his voice loud and insistent. "Step aside, please. Official business," he shouted, waving a badge that caught the sunlight. The crowd parted reluctantly, murmurs of curiosity spreading like ripples. The man approached Edward, handing him a folded piece of paper. Edward's expression didn't change as he accepted it, but a flicker of confusion crossed his face as he read the contents. Maya's curiosity was piqued. She subtly raised her camera, capturing the scene from a respectful distance. The interaction seemed unusual, even for a place as unpredictable as Buckingham Palace. Edward handed the paper back to the man, who gave a curt nod before walking away. The guard's composure remained intact, but Maya noticed his grip on his rifle tighten ever so slightly. Whatever was on that paper had clearly affected him, though he made no effort to show it. As the man disappeared into the crowd, Edward's gaze shifted, landing on Maya, For a brief moment their eyes met. This time, however, his expression wasn't one of disdain, but something closer to unease. Maya felt a chill run down her spine, unsure of what to make of the change. The rest of the crowd, oblivious to the subtle tension, resumed their chatter and photo-taking. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred. She glanced at Liam, who had returned to his post, his own brow furrowed in thought. Whatever had just happened wasn't part of the day's routine. Edward's mind raced as he tried to process the contents of the message. It was brief, cryptic even, but its implications were clear. Someone had been watching him, watching all of them, and had taken note of his earlier behavior. The message wasn't an official reprimand, but a warning. A reminder that his actions, no matter how small or seemingly inconsequential, carried weight. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to thin, the golden light fading into the soft hues of twilight. Maya lingered, her camera still in hand, drawn to the unfolding mystery. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for, but something told her this story wasn't over. Edward, too, felt the weight of the unresolved tension. For the first time in his career, he questioned his own actions, the cracks in his composure growing with each passing minute. What he didn't realize, however, was that the true consequences of his words and actions were still to come, waiting to unfold in ways he could never have anticipated. As twilight deepened, the once bustling area outside Buckingham Palace grew quieter. The thinning crowd allowed the majestic gates and stoic guards to reclaim their sense of authority and grandeur. Maya stayed put, drawn not just by the beauty of the place, but by an inexplicable feeling that there was more to be uncovered. The earlier incident with Edward had left her with a lingering unease, but it also sparked her curiosity. Something about the man in the suit and the paper he had handed Edward didn't sit right. It was clear that it wasn't just an ordinary day for the royal guards. Edward, standing rigidly at his post, felt like he was crumbling on the inside. The message had rattled him in ways he didn't expect. It wasn't the words themselves. They were vague enough to be dismissed as a routine warning, but the timing was too precise. Someone had seen what happened with Maya. Someone knew. But who? And why had it been brought to his attention so cryptically? His mind replayed the interaction, each moment now feeling magnified under an unseen microscope. What if this was more than a passing reprimand? What if it was the beginning of something bigger? Maya turned her camera off and sat on a nearby bench, taking a moment to review the events of the day in her mind. She thought about the guards, their unwavering discipline, and the stark contrast between Edward's cold demeanor and Liam's warmth. The tension between them was subtle but noticeable. It made her wonder if there was more going on behind those uniformed facades that met the eye. She felt a pang of sympathy for Liam, who seemed caught between his duty and his conscience. And then there was Edward. What drove his hostility? Was it personal, or had life in the guard hardened into everyone? Liam, on his part, couldn't shake the feeling that the situation with Edward was spiraling into something serious. He had noticed the man in the suit too, his badge flashing briefly as he passed by. The exchange had been swift, but it didn't go unnoticed. Liam's instincts told him that this wasn't a simple matter of protocol. He also noticed the way Edward's eyes darted toward Maya after reading the note. It was subtle, but it was there. Whatever was going on, it seemed to involve her in some way. As the last slivers of daylight faded, a cool breeze swept through the square, carrying with it an air of unpredictability. Maya pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, feeling both the chill and the growing tension. She watched as Edward and the other guards prepared for their shift change. The ceremonial precision with which they moved fascinated her, but she couldn't help but notice the way Edward's hands trembled ever so slightly as he adjusted his weapon. It was a small crack in his otherwise impenetrable demeanor, but it was enough to confirm that something was wrong. Suddenly, there was a commotion at the edge of the square. A young man, his clothes disheveled and his voice raised, pushed through the remaining tourists. He seemed agitated, shouting about being wrongfully accused of stealing. 2 security officers followed close behind, trying to calm him down. The disturbance caught everyone's attention, including Maya's and the guards. She instinctively grabbed her camera, ready to document what was happening. Edward stiffened, his training kicking in. He wasn't one to be easily rattled, but the day's events had left him on edge. As the young man approached the gates, his protests growing louder, Edward's grip tightened on his rifle. He glanced at Liam, who gave him a slight nod, signaling for caution. The young man stopped just short of the gates, his hands raised in frustration. "I didn't do anything," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why won't anyone listen to me?" Maya's heart went out to him. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the way he glanced around, searching for someone, anyone, who might believe him. It reminded her of moments in her own life when she'd felt unseen and unheard, when her voice hadn't been enough to sway those in power. The security officers caught up to the man, their tone firm but not unkind. "Sir, we need you to calm down. Let's talk this out somewhere else." "I didn't take anything," the man repeated, his voice trembling. "Why is it so hard for you to believe me?" The crowd, though smaller now, began to murmur again. Some people took out their phones to record, while others watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to skepticism. Maya felt a surge of determination. She couldn't stand by and let this moment pass without trying to capture the truth of it, whatever that might be. Edward's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. "Step back. This is not the place for a scene." The young man's eyes flicked at Edward, and for a moment the two locked gazes. There was a spark of defiance in the man's eyes, a refusal to back down despite the overwhelming odds against him. It was a look Edward wasn't used to seeing, one that mirrored the look Maya had given him earlier. Maya stepped closer, her camera at her side, but her voice steady. "He doesn't seem like he's here to cause trouble," she said, directing her words to the security officers, but loud enough for Edward to hear. "Maybe he just needs someone to listen." Edward turned his head sharply toward her, his expression unreadable. "This is not your concern," he said, his tone clipped. "It's everyone's concern when someone feels unfairly treated." Maya shot back, her voice calm but firm. Her words hung in the air, challenging not just Edward, but the atmosphere of authority that had settled over the square. Liam watched the exchange with growing unease. He admired Maya's courage, but he knew how easily situations like this could escalate. He decided to step in, breaking formation slightly to address the security officers. "Maybe we should take this somewhere less public," he suggested. "It might help calm things down." The officers exchanged glances before nodding. They gently guided the young man away from the gates, their tone softer now. The tension in the square eased slightly, but the echoes of the moment lingered. Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked at Edward one last time before turning back to her bench. He was staring straight ahead again, his face a mask of stoicism, but she could feel the weight of his gaze as she walked away. The night had fallen completely by the time Maya left the square, her mind buzzing with thoughts and questions. She couldn't shake the feeling that the day's events were interconnected, each thread leading to something larger. And as much as she wanted to let it go, she knew she couldn't. There was a story here, one that needed to be told, not just for her own sake, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unjustly judged. Unbeknownst to Maya, Edward was thinking about her too. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he could ignore the questions that were beginning to stir in his mind. Questions about his actions, his beliefs, and what it truly meant to wear the uniform he had always taken such pride in. The night deepened, and the once crowded area near Buckingham Palace was now almost deserted. The soft hum of distant traffic filled the air, mingling with the occasional murmur of late-night tourists passing by. Maya lingered near the gates, unable to shake the weight of the day's events. She gazed up at the palace, its lit windows casting a regal glow against the dark sky, and wondered if anyone inside was aware of what had transpired at its gates. Her mind kept circling back to Edward, the tension in his jaw, the flicker of unease in his eyes, and that strange exchange with the man in the suit. Something about it felt significant, as though it was the key to a larger puzzle. Maya wasn't sure why she cared so much. Maybe It was because she'd spent her life standing up against subtle injustices, or perhaps it was her instincts as a storyteller driving her curiosity. Either way, she knew she couldn't leave until she pieced together more of the story. Inside the guardhouse, Edward sat stiffly during a brief break, his thoughts racing. The note had been simple yet unsettling. Asterisk, your actions reflect on us all. Choose wisely, asterisk, he had no idea who had sent it or why, but the timing had been too precise to ignore. His earlier interaction with Maya flashed through his mind, the memory now tinged with a mix of regret and defensiveness. Why had he let himself speak so harshly? She hadn't done anything wrong, but something about her had triggered a reaction he didn't fully understand. Edward's thoughts were interrupted by Lim's voice. Rough day. Liam asked, leaning casually against the wall. His tone was light, but his eyes were probing. Edward shot him a sharp glance. I'm fine. Are you? Liam pressed, his voice lowering. Because I've been watching, and something's off. First, the way you spoke to that woman earlier. Then the man in the suit. And now you're acting like a storm's brewing in your head. What's going on, Edward? Edward hesitated, his pride warring with his need to confide in someone. Finally, he exhaled sharply. It's nothing. Just protocol stuff. Liam raised an eyebrow. Protocol stuff doesn't usually leave you looking like you've seen a ghost. Edward didn't respond, instead turning his gaze to the window. Outside, he could just make out the silhouette of Maya, still sitting on the bench. He felt a pang of guilt, though he wasn't sure why. He barely knew her, yet her presence lingered in his mind like an unresolved question. Liam followed Edward's gaze and spotted Maya too. She's still here, he said, his tone thoughtful. She's braver than most, I'll give her that. Edward frowned. She should just let it go. People like her, they always think they can change things, but the world doesn't work that way. Liam's expression hardened. People like her? You mean people who stand up for themselves? Or maybe you mean people who won't let a uniform intimidate them? Edward didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. Liam sighed, shaking his head. You know, for someone who wears this uniform, you seem to forget what it's supposed to stand for. Tradition isn't just about rules, Edward. It's about respect. And that goes both ways. Liam's words struck a nerve. But Edward didn't have time to respond. A sudden sound outside caught their attention. A loud clatter, followed by raised voices. Both men snapped into action, stepping outside to assess the situation. Maya had heard it too and stood, her camera at the ready. Near the gates, two figures were arguing, their voices growing louder. One was the young man from earlier, his frustration now boiling over. The other was an older man in an official-looking coat, his tone condescending as he waved a document in the younger man's face. This is nonsense. The young man shouted. You're just trying to pin this on me because I'm an easy target. The older man's voice was colder. You've been seen in the area multiple times. Suspicious behavior doesn't go unnoticed. Maya moved closer, careful not to draw attention to herself. She began recording, her instincts telling her this confrontation was part of the bigger story. From the corner of her eye, she saw Liam and Edward approaching, their uniforms making them immediately authoritative figures in the tense scene. Edward stepped forward, his voice firm. What's going on here? The older man turned to him, clearly irritated by the interruption. This is a private matter. No need for the guards to get involved. That doesn't look very private to me, Liam said, stepping up beside Edward. Maybe we can help de-escalate things. The young man looked between the guards, his eyes pleading. They're accusing me of theft, but I didn't take anything. I swear, I was just walking by. Edward's gaze hardened as he studied the young man. His training had taught him to assess situations quickly, to rely on logic and protocol. But as he looked into the young man's eyes, he saw something that gave him pause. Fear, yes, but also honesty. Edward felt a flicker of doubt, a nagging voice in the back of his mind reminding him of the earlier confrontation with Maya. Had he been too quick to judge her? Was he doing the same thing now? Maya's voice cut through the tension. "I've been here all evening," she said, stepping forward. "I saw him earlier, and he wasn't causing any trouble. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." The older man sneered. "And who are you?" "A tourist with a camera. Stay out of this." Maya didn't flinch. "I'm someone who believes in fairness. And right now, it doesn't look like he's being treated fairly." Edward felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond. He glanced at Liam, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. Slowly, Edward turned back to the young man. "Do you have anything that proves you weren't involved?" he asked, his tone less accusatory than before. The young man pulled out his phone, scrolling through a series of timestamps and photos. "I was taking pictures near the fountain," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "I even posted one online. You can check the time if you don't believe me." Liam leaned in to look, nodding in approval. "That's a solid alibi. It matches up with when the supposed theft happened." The older man bristled, clearly displeased. "This doesn't prove anything. He could have staged it." Edward's voice was quiet but firm. "Or he could be telling the truth. Maybe we need to look at this from another angle." The older man opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of approaching footsteps cut him off. The man in the suit from earlier appeared, his face grim as he handed another note to Edward. This time, Edward read it aloud. "The truth always comes to light. Watch closely." Everyone fell silent, the cryptic message hanging heavily in the air. Edward felt his pulse quicken, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. But the full picture remained just out of reach, the tension building toward a breaking point that none of them could yet see. Edward stood frozen, the weight of the note in his hand heavier than it should have been. The cryptic warning stirred a storm inside him, one that threatened to shatter the carefully constructed facade he wore. He glanced at the man in the suit, whose face remained unreadable, as though he was waiting for Edward to act. The others in the group exchanged uncertain glances, the tension palpable. Maya, always observant, kept her camera lowered but running, her instincts telling her that the night was far from over. The young man, still clutching his phone, looked at Edward with a mix of hope and apprehension. "See," he said, his voice edged with desperation. "I've been telling the truth. This has nothing to do with me." Edward opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Liam, who stepped closer and spoke in a low voice meant only for Edward's ears. "That note, it's not random. Someone's watching this situation closely, and it's bigger than just us." Edward nodded slowly, his gaze flickering between Liam, Maya, and the young man. "Stay here," he finally said, his tone commanding but steady. He turned back toward the guardhouse, clutching the note tightly. He needed a moment to think, to process, but also to act without the pressure of a dozen eyes on him. Liam stayed behind, his presence a calming force in the increasingly chaotic scene. Inside the guardhouse, Edward examined the note again. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar, the message brief but loaded with implications. He replayed the day's events in his mind, trying to piece together how everything connected: the altercation with Maya, the man in the suit, the accusations against the young man, and now this note. It felt like a web, and Edward was tangled in the center of it. For the first time in his career, he felt completely out of control. Outside, Maya's sharp eyes caught a movement in the shadows near the far edge of the square. A figure lingered there, partially hidden by the darkness, but unmistakably watching the group. She subtly adjusted her camera's lens, zooming in to capture the scene. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and wore a hood that obscured most of their face. They didn't move closer, but their presence was unnerving, as if they were waiting for the right moment to strike. "Who's that?" Maya whispered to Liam, nodding toward the shadowy figure. Lion followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "Stay here," he said firmly before walking toward the edge of the square. His hand hovered near his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. She glanced at the young man, who looked as uneasy as she felt. "Do you know him?" she asked softly, nodding toward the figure. The young man shook his head. No, but I don't like this. It's like they're waiting for something. Meanwhile, Liam approached the figure cautiously. Excuse me, he called out, his tone firm, but not aggressive. Can I help you with something? The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it took a slow step back, retreating further into the shadows. Liam's instincts screamed at him to stay alert. If you're here for a reason, you need to identify yourself, he said, his voice louder now. The figure finally spoke, their voice low and gravelly. You're in the middle of something you don't understand. Be careful who you trust. Liam's brows furrowed. What are you talking about? Who are you? But before he could get an answer, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness, their movements swift and deliberate. Liam hesitated, torn between pursuing them and returning to the group. Ultimately, he chose the latter, knowing that leaving Maya and the others unguarded was a risk he couldn't take. When Liam rejoined the group, his expression was grim. Whoever that was, they know something, he said, addressing Edward, who had just returned from the guardhouse. And they don't want us to figure it out. Edward frowned, his mind racing. This isn't a coincidence, he muttered. None of it is. That figure, the notes, even the accusations against him, he added, gesturing toward the young man. It's all connected. Maya spoke up, her voice steady despite the tension. Then we need to figure out what the connection is. Someone's trying to send a message, and it's up to us to figure out what they're saying. Edward's jaw tightened. This isn't a game. If we push too hard, we might make things worse. Or, Maya countered, we might uncover the truth. For a moment, the two locked eyes, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Edward didn't like the idea of involving a civilian, especially one as headstrong as Maya. But he couldn't deny that she was right. Something bigger was at play, and ignoring it wasn't an option. As the group stood in uneasy silence, a sudden noise shattered the calm. A loud crash from somewhere nearby, followed by the unmistakable sound of running footsteps. The noise came from the direction where the shadowy figure had disappeared. Without hesitation, Edward and Liam sprang into action, their training taking over as they moved toward the source of the commotion. Maya and the young man stayed behind, both of them on edge. Maya's camera was still rolling, capturing every moment. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew this was no longer just a story. It was something much more personal. And as the sound of Edward and Liam's footsteps faded into the distance, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were all walking straight into a trap. Edward and Liam moved quickly toward the source of the commotion, their boots echoing against the cobblestones as they cut through the darkness. The air was thick with tension, every shadow seeming to shift with unseen movement. As they neared the alley where the crash had sounded, they spotted a toppled trash can and scattered papers littering the ground. It was clear someone had been here, but they were gone now, leaving behind only faint traces of their presence. Edward scanned the area, his breathing steady but shallow. They're leading us somewhere, he said under his breath. This isn't random. Liam nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. We should call for backup. Before Edward could respond, a faint glow caught his attention. A small, flickering light coming from further down the alley. He motioned for Liam to follow as he approached cautiously. The glow grew brighter as they drew closer, and soon they found themselves standing before a discarded phone, its screen cracked but still illuminated. Edward picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the device. It was the young man's phone, the one he had shown earlier to prove his alibi. This doesn't make sense, Liam said, frowning. He had this with him back at the square. Edward's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle shifting but refusing to fit together. He was about to respond when the phone buzzed in his hand, a message popping up on the screen. The sender was anonymous, but the message was clear. Asterisk, look closer. The truth is in plain sight, asterisk. Back at the square, Maya and the young man waited anxiously. The silence around them was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Maya's camera remained steady, capturing the stillness as if it could tell a story of its own. The young man shifted uneasily, glancing at her. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't even know me." Maya looked at him, her expression soft but determined. "Because everyone deserves to be treated fairly, and because I've seen too many people walk away when they should have stayed and fought." Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps returned, drawing their attention. But instead of Edward and Liam, it was the man in the suit. He stepped into the light, his demeanor calm but calculating. His eyes flicked between Maya and the young man, lingering on the camera in her hands. "You've been busy," he said, his tone icy. Maya straightened, her grip on the camera tightening. "And you've been hiding. Why don't you tell us what's really going on?" The man smirked, taking a slow step closer. "You think you've figured it out, don't you? But we're only scratching the surface." Maya didn't flinch, her voice steady. "Then why don't you fill in the gaps?" Before he could respond, Edward and Liam returned, their expressions a mix of confusion and urgency. Edward held up the phone, addressing the young man. "Is this yours?" The young man's eyes widened. "Yeah, but how did you get it?" "I had it with me the whole time." Edward's grip on the phone tightened. "Not anymore. Someone's playing games, and they want us to follow their trail." The man in the suit laughed softly, drawing their attention. "You're smarter than you look," he said, addressing Edward. "But you're still missing the point." "What point?" Edward demanded, his frustration boiling over. "Why don't you stop talking in riddles and tell us what you're really after?" The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "This isn't about what I want. It's about what you've overlooked. The truth has been staring you in the face the entire time." Edward opened his mouth to respond, but Maya cut him off, her voice sharp. "He's right. The truth is here. It's him." She turned her camera toward the young man, her tone steady but accusatory. "You've been playing the victim, but you're the one pulling the strings, aren't you?" The young man's face shifted, his earlier nervousness replaced by a calm, almost smug expression. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice cool. "I didn't think you'd figure it out, though. Not this quickly." Edward and Liam exchanged stunned looks, the realization hitting them like a wave. "You've set this up," Edward said, his voice low. "The confrontation, the accusations, it was all part of your plan." The young man shrugged. "People see what they want to see. You saw me as a victim, so I let you believe it. And she," he added, nodding toward Maya, "saw a story. Everyone played their part perfectly." Maya's grip on her camera tightened, anger flashing in her eyes. "Why? What was the point of all this?" The young man smiled faintly. "Sometimes the best way to expose a system's flaws is to make it collapse from within. You wanted the truth. There it is." Edward stepped forward, his tone firm. "You think this justifies what you've done? Manipulating people, wasting resources, this isn't justice." The young man met his gaze evenly. "No, it's not. But it's reality. And now, everyone will see it too." Before anyone could respond, the man in the suit stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "This ends now," he said, addressing the young man. "You've made your point, but there are consequences for your actions." The young man didn't resist as the man in the suit led him away, his expression unreadable. Maya lowered her camera, her mind racing. She had come here seeking a story, but what she found was far more complicated than she'd anticipated. As the night quieted once more, Edward turned to Maya, his expression somber. "You got your truth," he said. "But was it worth it?" Maya didn't answer right away. She looked at the camera in her hands, the weight of the night's events pressing down on her. "The truth is always worth it," she said finally, "even when it's not what you expect."